It's Bible Club, it's Bible Club, it's Bible Club in our town. There's singing, there's laughing, let's get the word on the ground. We're all excited, and we are all delighted. It's Bible Club, Bible Club, Bible Club, Bible Club, Bible Club in our town.
Now is the time for our lesson, and we're in the fourth lesson of our series, and we can all see, right? What's our series? What have our lessons been about? Wisdom. That's right. Can you remember anything? Each of you, what do you remember about just one thing from one of our lessons about wisdom? We had a lesson about wisdom last week, about family. We had wisdom for life. Week before that, wisdom comes from God. What do you remember? Does anybody remember something from one of our lessons about wisdom? You remembered from 2 weeks ago, maybe, because you weren't able to come last week. What do you remember?
He had a dream about God, and he was going to be the king, so he asked for wisdom.
He asked for wisdom. So he did. Does anybody remember who he is that Aaron is talking about? What is the name of him? Allie? Solomon. That's right. So Solomon had a vision, and God said, what do you want? Right? What would we say if God said, what do you want? Oh. But Solomon knew he was going to be king. As a king, he would probably need money to run the government, right? He would need a strong army. He would want protection so other people wouldn't come and attack his people. But what he thought he needed most was wisdom. He wanted to make sure that he was a good, righteous king for his people. And God said, that was a good answer, didn't he? In fact, God said, since you asked for wisdom, I'm also going to give you all that other stuff, too. So, good answer. Does anybody remember something else that we've learned about wisdom in the last 3 weeks? Anybody remember anything else? No? Well, that's good enough. So Solomon was going to be a king, right? Does anybody remember who Solomon's dad was? Who was Solomon's dad? Was he a king? Solomon's dad was a king? Okay. So do you remember what his name was? Class, let's say his name. King
David.
King David. That's right. King David. Does anybody remember something about King David? God said that King David was a man after, can you fill in the rest of that? A man after, Cody? After his own heart. After God's own heart. He was a man after God's own heart. And one of the things that God promised David, he said to David, I will make sure, just so you know what's going on, the boy from next door is very interested in Bible club, but he's very shy too. Okay, so he wants to just watch from outside the window. So we don't want to make fun of him, we don't want to pay too much attention over there. Try to pay attention here. But that's why he's out there making noises. Someday, I bet he's going to come. We just have to be kind to him when we see him. So, David wanted to build God a temple, a house. And God said, you know what? Your son will build a house, but I am going to build you a house. In fact, I'm going to say that there will always be one of your sons on the throne of Israel. That was a pretty good promise. Was David's dad a king? No. The king before David was Saul, and he was not. Saul's son was Jonathan, and some other ones. So God promised David that he would always have a son sit on the throne of Israel. Is anybody sitting on the throne of Israel today? No. But will there be somebody sit on the throne of Israel someday? Yes. And who is that? Jesus. That's right. And Jesus and what we know about Jesus is that he is a son of David. Right? He is his mother. He was all God and all man, but his mother, great grandfather was David. So God has kept his promise to David. And someday, when Jesus reigns on the earth, a son of David will be on the throne again in Jerusalem. Now, we're going to talk about that at the end. Even before David was a king, even before Solomon was a king, even before Saul was a king, God wrote in the law, and in his law, today when we say the law of God, where do we find the law of God? In the Bible, right. So they didn't have books like this. They wrote them out on scrolls and stuff like that because they couldn't have the technology that we have. But they still had pen and something to write on and ink. And so God had Moses write out some rules for kings of Israel. So God's law for kings. The first of God's laws for kings is, can you read this from back there or should I read it to you? I'll read it to you. He had to be a Jew whom God has chosen. Okay? So God chose Saul, right? So he fit that. God chose David. He fit that. God even chose Solomon. Okay? So Solomon was, he could obey that law, right? Could you obey that law? Are any of you Jews? So none of us can be a king of Israel, can we? Okay. So some other laws, and then we'll get in our lesson. He was not to have, this is all the way back, Moses was hundreds of years before David and Solomon. Moses wrote this down for us from God. God's laws for the kings of Israel, they were not to have many or lots of horses and no horses from Egypt. Okay? We don't exactly understand all of that, but one of the reasons would be that the people of Israel were supposed to depend on God to be their defense and not on their own armies. A horse would make your army even more powerful, kind of like a tank or an airplane today, back then. So they're to depend on God to be their defenders. They had to fight, but they didn't need to have lots of horses and no horses from Egypt because God would be their defender. Then, God said the king is not to have lots of wives. Now, God said, how many wives should be in a marriage? One. How many husbands in a marriage? One. How many people in a marriage? Two. One man and one woman makes a marriage. But in the Bible times, a lot of people, they didn't exactly do that. And a lot of times, kings would have more than one wife. The country next to them, their king would say, "Would you marry my daughter?" And kind of like a peace treaty, because the king over there would say, well, if my daughter is his wife, then for sure he won't send his armies to fight against me, his wife's father. Okay? So a lot of that happened, and some kings had many, many wives. Even David had several wives. But that was a law that God had for the kings. The fourth one, they're not to have stacks of gold and silver. Now they had to have money, but they weren't to have just lots and lots and lots of money. And the fifth law is that they were to make a copy of all God's law for himself. So when they became king, they had to get their own set of writing materials out. They had a copy of the law. They would read it and write it down. And how many of you ever copied your spelling words out? Have you ever copied spelling words out? Well, this isn't spelling words. This is the whole law of God. They had to look at it, write it down. Look at it, write it down. And then when they finished that, they were to read it. Probably supposed to read it each day. So, those were the laws for kings. Those are good laws. So, Solomon, we know in the beginning of his kingdom, he was a godly man. What did he ask for from God? He asked for wisdom, right? He asked for wisdom. Last week we learned about how he and his wife had a very special relationship, right? Well, I would like to say that Solomon always was a man that was a godly man. He was a wise man, and he wrote the whole book of Proverbs. He wrote all kinds of proverbs and he ended up that he did not even obey his own Proverbs. He did not even listen to his own wisdom. That's not a good thing, is it? And we're going to see how that happened. So after a while, Solomon had been king for a long time, and I don't know exactly the details of how it got set up, but the king of Pharaoh, I said this the last time again, the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh from Egypt, his daughter and Solomon got married. So, Solomon was already married, right? But now he married Pharaoh's daughter, the king of Egypt. And pretty soon, probably some other king, maybe the king of the Hittites, said, would you marry my daughter? And then the king of Moab said, would you marry my daughter? And then some other rich man from Edom said, would you marry my daughter? And then Solomon was looking around and said, she looks nice, maybe I'll have her to be my wife too. And then her, and so pretty soon Solomon had dozens of wives. Now, those wives from those other countries, who did they worship in other countries? They worshiped idols. That's right. They worshiped idols. But Solomon, and so should Solomon have married an idol worshiper? No, he shouldn't have. God had said that nobody in Israel, not even the king, should marry an idol worshiper. Well, Solomon, he kept on. He married more than dozens of women. Pretty soon he had hundreds of wives. I don't understand all the names, but somehow, however it was arranged, the Bible tells us in the end, Solomon had 1,000 women that he treated like a wife, some way or another. I don't know, that's about one every day for about 3 years. I don't know how that works out. But I know he wasn't keeping that law, right? So, he couldn't break this law. We know he did this because all those proverbs that he wrote are coming. They're just another way of teaching us what God's law said, and they're so powerful. So he did this, but he must have stopped doing the read it every day, right? Because after a while, he wasn't doing what it said. And you know what happened with all those wives that he had? I don't know if exactly it happened this way, but I imagine one day, one of his wives said, Solomon, you are so handsome. I love the way you take care of me and everything. You're so wise. But you know that I'm from this other country and I have my God, and I would like a place where I could worship my God here in Jerusalem. How should Solomon have answered that? No. But he didn't. He must have thought, well, I worship God at the temple. In fact, I built him a giant temple. I love God. But it won't hurt if I build this wife a little place where she can worship her idol. And so he did. Well, what do you think happened after that? One of the other idol-worshiping wives came to Solomon and said, oh, Solomon, you are so handsome, and you are strong, and you are so wise, and I saw that you built a place for your other wife to worship her idol. Could you build me a place to worship my idol? And what do you think Solomon should have said? No. He should have seen the handwriting on the wall. He should have said, no, and we better get that one out of here. But did he do that? No. He was not acting very wise, was he? No. And what do you think happened after that? He built it for her. That's right. And then another wife came and said, Solomon, I see that you built a place for this other wife of yours to worship her idol, and for this one, I would like a place for me to worship my idol. And what do you think Solomon did? He did it. But do you think it stopped there? Pretty soon, there were places to worship idols all over the city of Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem is God's city. It's the city where his temple was built. But there was little spots to worship idols all over the city of Jerusalem. Then, I think something like this happened. One of his wives came to him and said, Solomon, today is a special day. I worship my idol in a very special way today. And I would just love it if you would come with me when I worship my idol today. And what do you think Solomon thought?
Yes.
He probably thought, it's probably not a good thing to do, but I worship God at the temple. I'm not going to worship the God. I'm just going to go with her while she worships her God. And so he did. He went there, and while she worshipped her idol, he was there with, he watched. And what happened? Some other wife said, Solomon, won't you come with me while I worship my idol? Pretty soon Solomon was going with, while his wives were worshiping all these other idols. And then you know what happened after that? One of his wives said, Solomon, it would really make me feel good if you would worship, if you would burn incense while I worship my idol. And burning incense would be worshiping. Would you do with me what we do over here? It's not that bad. It's not really anything. It's not that big of a deal. And what should Solomon have done? No. He should have said, I'm sorry, I've got too far in here. We need to get rid of this stuff. This is not right. But do you think he did that?
No.
Was he being very wise? No. What he did is he did start worshiping those idols. And so Solomon, he started out good, but he didn't end up good. God warned him. And a few of the things that God warned Solomon did happen. God warned Solomon that if he would not continue to follow him, he would take the kingdom away from him, or he would rip the kingdom apart underneath of him. And if you remember from our stories, Solomon died, but when his son came to the throne, 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel, they said, we're not having you as a king. Remember? And there was a divided kingdom, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And you want to know something else? There is not going to be a son of Solomon on the throne of Israel. Jesus is not the son of Solomon. Mary, he's the son of Mary, and Mary's great-grandfather's name was Nathan, one of Solomon's brothers. Yeah. So God didn't let in the rolls of history where it has famous people's names, Solomon is there on one side, but he's not there on Mary's side. And so Solomon is not a father of Jesus. God judged him. Now, Solomon, I think, as he got older, he started realizing the wrong things that he did. But either way, the book of Ecclesiastes tells us some things that we can learn from Solomon after he lived a long life about what the world thinks, about what's wise. You know, the world says we can be happy, or we can have satisfaction in our life if we just have fun, right? How many of you like to have fun? I like to have fun. Isn't it enjoyable when we have fun? It is. So, we can learn from Solomon that if all we ever do is seek to have fun, if you say, I'm going to have fun, my whole life I'm going to have fun, will you be satisfied? Solomon teaches us no. Solomon had everything he wanted. He could have had as much fun as he wanted whenever he wanted. He was so smart. He had all the right people in place. He could do whatever he wanted. He could search and seek after and have all the pleasure and all the fun he wanted to have. And we can learn from Solomon that in the end, that's empty. And in fact, the truth is, it doesn't satisfy because it stops. How many of you have had fun before? Yeah. Are you still having that fun right now? No. Right? You're doing something else that's very fun, right? But we're not out on the boat on the lake right now, are we? No. Can we stay out on the boat on the lake all of our life? No, it has to stop. So if we say, oh, I will have peace and joy if I could just be out on the boat. Well, you could have joy and fun while you're out on the boat, and then it's over. Because you got to bring the boat back. Or whatever it is that you can say, I could have fun if I could just play my games. Right? You can play your game on your phone. Can you play your game on your phone all the time?
Yeah.
No, you can't. You can't. It's going to end. Another thing Solomon teaches us is that learning doesn't give satisfaction in the end. Some people think that if they just knew everything, that would take care of life. They would, and so they go to school. Should you go to school? Yes. It's a good thing to go to school. But some people just keep going to school. They keep going to school, they finish high school, and they go to college, which is a good thing to do. And then after college, they go to graduate school. And then after graduate school, they go to more graduate school. And then they go to more graduate school and they become a doctor. All kinds of different doctors. And then they are a doctor, and what do? They find a school where they can keep studying and learning more things, and they discover things, and they write books. They just try to learn for their whole life. Are they ever satisfied? If that's all they live for, they're not satisfied, because you know what? You can't learn everything. There's only one person that knows everything, right? And who's that? God. God's the only one that knows everything. We can't know everything. We could try and try and try, but we will never learn everything. And Solomon teaches us that it's good to learn, but if you say, I'll have peace and joy and satisfaction in my life if I just learn everything, it's not going to happen. Solomon teaches us that hard work satisfies but doesn't completely satisfy. Solomon was a hard worker. He built the temple, right? And then he built his house. And he had so much, he was able to build the most magnificent. He built stables for all of his horses. He built cities to store all of his stuff. He had so much. He was a hard worker. And I will tell you, when you work hard and you've accomplished something, that gives you satisfaction. But you know what? You can't keep working and accomplishing things. You have to finish sometime, right? And so working hard doesn't completely satisfy. You could have luxury. Solomon, in his houses, they were so fancy. He had pools in them, and fountains, and fruit trees. He had everything. He even could hire musicians. Now, we might be able to go to a concert sometime. But he could just hire the whole orchestra, and they could play whenever he wanted them to, right? So he could have all of those nice things, but that doesn't satisfy. Solomon teaches us that nothing satisfies. Solomon teaches us some more. When we go to seek after things, some of you might say, I know some people that they really wanted an iPhone 6. Who wants an iPhone 6? Right? Anymore. Or some people really wanted a BlackBerry phone. Right? Does anybody want one of those now?
No.
You don't even know what they are anymore. Right? But you go and you try, if I could just have this, and once you get it, it's like it disappeared. You could say, what I want is an iPhone 14. But there will be, won't there? And as soon as there will be, as soon as it's here, what are they going to start talking about? The iPhone 15. So we could say, if I could just have that, and then when you have it, it's like, oh, but if I could just have that. Isn't that the way life is? Solomon teaches us that in the book of Ecclesiastes, you keep looking for something, and you keep wanting something, and it's like you finally get it, and it turns to nothing in your hands. Solomon tells us, you know what, these hearts here, this is not a Valentine heart. These hearts have been darkened because they're sinful, right? And Solomon reminds us that everybody sins. Everybody sins. And what happens for everyone someday? What does this picture show us? What is that right there? He's dead, right? Does anybody live forever? No. So you could learn a whole bunch of things, right? You could have all kinds of fun. You could have a beautiful big house. You could have all of those things, but someday you are going to die and go into the grave, right? Someday, and then, what about all that stuff? Does it go into the grave with you?
No.
I mean, they put a suit on you when you're in the casket, but can you enjoy that suit while you're there under the ground? No. It's not like you took it with you, right? No, you can't take anything with you. But what will happen? You go in the grave, you leave everything else behind, but then what happens? What's going on right here? Yeah. Solomon, we'll just say this is Solomon. He had all that stuff, but one day he went into the grave. All the stuff he had stayed behind. And what did Solomon do?
Go to heaven.
He did. But when he got there, what did he have to do? He had to stand before God. Right? He had to stand before God. And God probably said something like, I gave you all that wisdom, but then you didn't use it, did you? Right? So, and the Bible teaches us that every single person will stand before God someday. But the Bible also tells us that every single person has a heart that's darkened by sin. And if we have sin in our hearts, when we stand before God, will God let us stay there in heaven with Him if we have sin? He will not. Now the New Testament tells us about how we can have those sins washed away, right? Our story that Miss Megan has been telling us tells us about the Muslim boy who learned how Jesus Christ could come into his life and wash his sins away. If you have never turned from your sin and believed on Jesus, you have that heart that's darkened by sin. And if you were to die, you would have to stand before God. Do little kids die? Not very often, but do they? Yeah. None of us are guaranteed that we're going to live till we're 80, are we? No. And so all of us, when we die, will stand before God. And we want to make sure, but while we're here on this earth, we can make sure that we have turned from our sin and believed on Jesus. And then when we stand before God, He won't judge our sin because He's already judged it in Jesus. So, Solomon, at the end of his life, tells us to remember a few things. He says, while you're young, how many of you are young? Yes, we all have our hands up. While you're young, remember your Creator. Who's your Creator? God is your Creator. And since He created you, can He tell you what you should do with your life? Yes. So that's what, it doesn't just mean remember that you were created. It means remember your Creator. God is your Creator. And since He's the Creator, He has the right to tell you what to do. Whether He tells you to do it each minute of the day, or what you do for a job, what you study when you go to school and you have choices about that. God is your Creator, and He has the right to tell you what to do. He's already told us a bunch of things to do, right? And the things that He's told us to do are in the Bible, right? So if we just read that, we will know a lot of the things that our Creator has told us to do. He's told us to obey our parents, right? He's told us to obey the policeman. Doesn't use that word, right? But He's told us a lot of things in here that we should just do. So Solomon reminds us to remember our Creator and to fear God. And one of the other things Solomon teaches us in the book of Ecclesiastes is to live for God with what He's given us. It teaches us to be content. Okay? We have opportunities to learn. We should learn. for the glory of God. But we shouldn't say, if I could just learn more, if I could learn even more, if I could learn even more, because will that satisfy? No, we should be content, satisfied with what God's given us. Are we allowed to enjoy life and have fun? Yes. But should we say, if I could just have more fun, if I could just, I'm going to work this week so I can spend my money on having fun. Is that what we should do? No. Okay. Are we allowed to live in a house? Are we allowed to build a house when we get older? Yes. But should we say, well, now this house, I want a bigger house. I want another house. Should we do that? No. We should live content. We should live satisfied with what God has given us. And so Ecclesiastes teaches us, let's remember those three things. One is remember our Creator. Two is to fear God, and that means to obey Him. We've talked about the fear of the Lord. And the third is to live contented, to live satisfied with what God has given us and where He has put us. So that is what the Bible says. And that about living in this world, and that's a lot different than what this world says, isn't it? If you think about it, what you see on TV, what you learn in different places, is different than that. But what's right? What the Bible says or what the world tells us? Pretty easy answer, right? The Bible is what's right.